In April 1846, the Donner Party left Springfield, Illinois, carrying 150 pounds of flour, 75 pounds of bacon, and 30 pounds of coffee per adult. By December, they were boiling oxhide and shoe leather. Most pioneers never reached that desperation, but their daily diet on the 2,000-mile Oregon Trail would horrify a modern American. Number 14 on this list was so revolting that one traveler wrote it nearly made him leap from his wagon. Yet it kept more pioneers alive than any other dish. Number 3 has been studied by Harvard nutritionists who now call it one of the most complete survival foods ever invented. These 25 meals fueled the westward migration of over 400,000 Americans between 1841 and 1869. Hit that subscribe button. Let us count down the 25 forgotten foods American pioneers actually ate on the Oregon Trail. Number 25, hasty pudding. The most boring meal on the Oregon Trail was also the most reliable. Hasty pudding was nothing but cornmeal stirred into boiling salted water until it thickened into a stiff porridge. Sometimes it took 20 minutes. Sometimes the wind blew out the cook fire 3 times before it ever got there. Pioneer women carried 50-pound sacks of cornmeal in the wagon because the meal cost about $1 a hundredweight in Independence, Missouri in 1846, and it kept for months without spoiling. Once the porridge was thick enough to hold a spoon upright, a pioneer family poured it into a tin plate and let it cool until it set firm. The next morning, the leftover slab was sliced and fried in bacon grease for breakfast. Same food, 2 completely different meals. A diary kept by Elizabeth Gear in 1847 mentions hasty pudding 9 times in a single month. It was filling, cheap, and always there. Number 24, Johnny cakes. When the cornmeal turned into something resembling bread, it was called a Johnny cake. Pioneer women mixed cornmeal with a pinch of salt and just enough water to form a thick batter, then dropped tablespoon-sized portions onto a hot iron skillet, or, when no skillet was available, directly onto a flat rock heated in the campfire embers. The cakes browned fast at the edges and stayed soft in the middle. Some travelers added a spoonful of molasses or a chopped wild onion to the batter for variety, but the base recipe needed nothing else. The name was a shortened form of journey cake because the cakes traveled well in a saddlebag and tasted nearly the same on day 3 as they did fresh off the rock. Pioneer children gnawed on cold Johnny cakes during long stretches between meals, the same way modern kids eat granola bars. A handful of cornmeal could make 8 cakes. 8 cakes could feed a family of 4 through a hard afternoon. The math worked because it had to. Number 23, slapjacks. When flour was available and the family had managed to keep its sourdough starter alive, slapjacks made an appearance. These were the pioneer version of pancakes, though they bore little resemblance to anything sold at a modern diner. Flour, water, a pinch of saleratus, and sometimes a spoonful of sourdough starter were mixed into a runny batter and poured into a hot skillet. The cakes cooked fast and were flipped with a sharp jerk of the wrist, which is how they got their name. Pioneers ate them with whatever sweetener they had, molasses, sorghum syrup, or just a sprinkle of brown sugar dampened with water. A 100-pound barrel of flour cost about $4 in Independence in 1850, an enormous investment that had to last the entire journey. Mothers rationed slapjacks the way modern families ration vacation desserts. Sunday morning on the trail, with the wagons circled and the cattle grazing, was slapjack morning. Children remembered it for the rest of their lives. Number 22, saleratus bread. Here is something almost completely forgotten by modern American kitchens. Saleratus was an early form of baking soda harvested directly from natural mineral deposits in present-day Wyoming. Pioneers crossing the Sweetwater region would stop at the famous Saleratus Lake, scoop up the white crystalline crust, and store it in tin canisters for use as a leavening agent the entire way to Oregon. The crystals had a slightly bitter taste, but mixed into flour and water with a pinch of salt and a splash of buttermilk. When buttermilk was available, they made a quick-rising bread that did not require a starter. Pioneers called the loaves Saleratus biscuits and baked them in a Dutch oven buried in coals beside the evening fire. A skilled trail cook could produce 12 biscuits in under an hour, fluffier than anything made with yeast alone. The dish disappeared from American cooking when commercial baking powder hit the shelves in the 1860s. Few modern cooks have ever heard of it. Number 21, dried apples. Of all the small luxuries packed into a covered wagon, dried apple rings traveled the best. They were strung on cotton string in late summer, hung in attics until leather tough, and then folded into burlap sacks for the journey west. Pioneer women rationed them carefully, knowing the moment the apples ran out, the only fruit available would be whatever wild berries they could find. A cup of dried apples soaked in warm water for an hour would swell back into something almost like fresh fruit. Cooked down with a spoonful of sugar and a pinch of cinnamon, they made applesauce that lifted spirits at the end of a long, dust-choked day. Some families stretched the apples by simmering them with hardtack to make a primitive apple pudding. A pound of dried apples sold for about 12 cents in 1849 and represented roughly 4 pounds of fresh fruit. When the supply ran low, mothers gave the last pieces to the children. Some things had not changed. Number 20, vinegar. A jug of cider vinegar was worth more than its weight in coffee on the Oregon Trail. Pioneers carried it in stoneware jugs lashed to the wagon side, and it served 3 completely separate purposes. First, a tablespoon of vinegar added to a canteen of brackish creek water made the water drinkable, cutting the metallic taste and killing some of the bacteria that caused dysentery. Second, vinegar mixed with sugar, flour, and water produced vinegar pie, a dessert that fooled exhausted taste buds into thinking they were eating lemon meringue. Third, vinegar splashed into a wilting pot of greens or beans brightened the entire flavor and helped prevent scurvy, the silent killer of overland travelers. A gallon of cider vinegar cost about 22 cents in 1848 and lasted a family of 6 the entire 4-month journey. Modern homesteaders are starting to keep vinegar jugs in their kitchens again. The wisdom went out of style for 100 years. It is creeping back. Number 19, dried peas. Long before the dried beans took over the American pantry, dried peas were the staple legume of westbound migration. They cost about 5 cents a pound in St. Louis in 1845, and they cooked down in roughly half the time of dried beans, which mattered enormously when fuel was scarce. Pioneer women soaked the peas overnight in a covered pot left near the dying embers of the fire, then simmered them in the morning with a chunk of salt pork until they broke down into a thick, gray-green porridge. The result was called peas porridge, and yes, the old nursery rhyme was about exactly this dish: peas porridge hot, peas porridge cold, peas porridge in the pot, 9 days old. That was not poetic exaggeration. Pioneers actually did eat the same pot of peas for over a week, reheating it each morning and stretching it with a splash of water as needed. The dish has all but vanished from American kitchens. Split pea soup is its closest modern cousin. Number 18, wild greens. Pioneer women learned fast that the prairie was not empty. Wild purslane, lamb's quarter, miner's lettuce, dandelion greens, and dock all grew along the trail in abundance, and any woman who had read a copy of Buchan's Domestic Medicine, and most had, knew that fresh greens were the difference between healthy children and children with bleeding gums by July. The greens were picked at evening camp, washed in a tin basin of water, and either eaten raw with a splash of vinegar or wilted in bacon grease over the fire. Purslane, which most modern Americans pull as a weed, contains more omega-3 fatty acids than any other leafy green ever measured. Lamb's quarter outranks spinach in both calcium and vitamin A. Pioneer mothers did not know any of this. They knew the children stayed healthy when the greens went into the pot. That was enough. Number 17, sago lily bulbs. Here is the meal that saved the Mormon pioneers during the famine winter of 1848. When the crops failed in the Salt Lake Valley and the food stores ran dangerously low, Shoshone scouts showed the settlers how to dig sago lily bulbs out of the dry prairie soil. The bulbs, about the size of a chestnut, were boiled until soft, then mashed and eaten plain or fried in whatever fat was available. The flavor was mild, slightly sweet, and starchy enough to be filling. The technique spread quickly along the Oregon Trail and saved an unknown number of pioneers who would otherwise have starved between supply stops. Today, the sago lily is the official state flower of Utah, a designation chosen specifically to honor the bulbs that fed the Mormon settlers through their first winter. Almost no one alive has eaten one. The bulbs take 7 years to mature, and the plant is now protected in most states. The knowledge that pioneers used to take for granted is now nearly extinct. Number 16, cattail roots. Wherever the trail crossed a slough, a swamp, or a slow creek bend, pioneers stopped to harvest cattails. Almost every part of the plant was edible, but the starch roots were the prize. Pioneer women would wade barefoot into the cold mud, pull up the long white rhizomes, scrape off the brown outer layer, and either roast the roots directly in the embers or pound them with a stone to extract the starch, which could be mixed with flour to stretch a sack of cornmeal. The young shoots, peeled and eaten raw, tasted something like cucumber. The pollen, harvested in summer, was used as a flour substitute that turned biscuits a bright golden yellow. 1 acre of cattails produces more starch per year than an acre of potatoes, a fact that modern survival experts only rediscovered in the 1970s. Pioneer women had it figured out by 1843. They could turn a roadside ditch into supper without breaking stride. First pattern break. Here is what most people get wrong about pioneer cooking. The covered wagon was not just transportation. It was a moving kitchen, a moving pantry, a moving root cellar, and a moving butcher shop, all packed into a wooden box 12 feet long and 4 feet wide. Underneath the wagon hung the tar bucket for greasing the axles. Inside, a wooden chuck box bolted to the rear held flour, sugar, coffee, salt, and saleratus. Lashed to the side were a Dutch oven, a coffee pot, a frying pan, a tin water keg, and a smaller barrel of vinegar. The cooking happened entirely outside, over open fires built from buffalo chips when the trees ran out, and they ran out fast on the open prairie. A pioneer woman cooking dinner had to gather chips, build a fire, fight the wind, cook a meal for 8, and pack everything back into the wagon, all before sundown. The work began before dawn and ended after dark. 6 days a week for 4 months. Nobody filmed it, nobody wrote songs about it, they just did it. Number 15, prairie chicken. Prairie chicken, also called pinnated grouse, blanketed the Great Plains in numbers no modern American can imagine. Pioneer hunters carrying single-shot muzzle-loading rifles could drop 3 or 4 birds in a single morning without traveling more than a mile from camp. The meat was darker and stronger than chicken. closer to a duck in flavor, and a single bird weighed about 2 pounds, enough to make a substantial stew for a family of 4. Pioneer women plucked the birds, gutted them, and either roasted them whole on a green stick spit over the fire or cut them into pieces for a quick stew with wild onions and a handful of flour to thicken the broth. The bones went into the pot for a second round the next morning, simmered into a clear, golden broth that became the base for cornmeal mush. Today, the greater prairie chicken is considered a threatened species across most of its former range. Number 14. Snake meat. Here is the dish that scandalized the Eastern press. When game was scarce and provisions ran low, pioneers ate rattlesnake. Western diary entries from the 1850s describe in detail how a rattler was killed with a stick, beheaded, skinned, and either fried in bacon grease or boiled into a stew. The meat was white, mild, and slightly chewy, comparable to chicken, but with a denser, fibrous texture. One Mormon traveler named James Pratt wrote in 1849 that the first bite of rattlesnake nearly made him leap from his wagon, but by the end of the meal he was reaching for seconds. Eastern newspapers picked up these accounts and ran lurid headlines about the savagery of westward travel. The pioneers themselves treated rattlesnake as nothing more than another protein source. The snake had bitten his cattle, killed his dog, threatened his children. Eating it was justice as much as it was supper. Modern Texas roadhouses still serve fried rattlesnake as a novelty. In 1850, it was Tuesday dinner. Number 13, wild onion. The single most important seasoning on the Oregon Trail came out of the ground. Wild onions, the small purple-flowered variety that grew across the prairie from Nebraska to Idaho, were dug up at every evening camp and tossed into the stew pot. They were stronger than cultivated onions, sharper, almost garlicky, and a single handful could season a pot big enough to feed 12. Pioneer women learned to spot the green shoots from inside a moving wagon, then sent the children running with tin pails to dig them up at the next halt. The bulbs could also be braided onto strings and hung from the wagon bows to dry, providing seasoning long after the fresh ones had wilted. Lewis and Clark mentioned wild onions in their journals dozens of times, often noting that the men were happier and ate more on nights when onions were in the pot. Pioneer cooks knew the same thing. A stew without onions was just hot water. A stew with onions was supper. Number 12, coffee with chicory. Pioneers drank more coffee than water. A typical adult on the Oregon Trail consumed 3 to 4 cups a day, made strong, made bitter, and made without much regard for whether the beans were even coffee at all. When the real Arbuckle's coffee ran low, women mixed in roasted chicory root, dried dandelion root, or even roasted acorns ground fine to stretch the supply. The result tasted earthy and slightly bitter, but it kept its kick. A pound of roasted coffee cost about 30 cents in 1849, which was a fortune by trail standards, so the bean was treated like a precious metal. Coffee was boiled, never brewed. The grounds were thrown directly into a tin pot of cold water, brought to a hard boil, and left to settle for 30 seconds before pouring. The first cup of the morning was the best. The last cup of the night, made from the same grounds boiled 3 times, tasted like wet tobacco. Nobody complained. Without coffee, the wagons did not move. Number 11, Pioneer Pottage. Pottage was the official name for everything in the pot. When the day's hunt brought in a rabbit, half a prairie chicken, and a handful of cattail roots, all of it went into the same Dutch oven with a bit of bacon grease, a sprinkle of flour, and whatever wild greens the children had gathered. The pot simmered slowly while the family packed up the next morning's load and unhitched the oxen, releasing the smell of fat and meat and onion across the campsite. No two pots ever tasted the same. The variety, accidental as it was, kept pioneers from losing their minds over the monotony of beans and bacon. Pottage was also the meal that fed sick travelers. A bowl of warm broth with soft chunks of meat was the closest thing to medicine the trail had to offer. Pioneer mothers ladled it out for cholera patients, for women in labor, for children too tired to chew. Often was all that stood between recovery and a roadside grave. Number 10. Bone marrow. The most concentrated nutrition on the Oregon Trail came from the inside of a buffalo leg bone. After the meat was butchered and the hide set out to dry, the long marrow bones were cracked open with the back of an axe, and the gray-pink marrow scooped out with a knife. It was eaten raw, spread on hardtack like butter, or roasted briefly in a tin pan until it turned amber and began to bubble. The flavor was rich, nutty, and so dense it could turn a piece of stale bread into a meal. A single buffalo femur contained nearly a cup of marrow, packed with fat, iron, and vitamins A and K. Indigenous tribes had been eating it this way for centuries, and pioneers who crossed paths with Pawnee or Cheyenne scouts often picked up the practice within their first month on the trail. Modern bone broth restaurants in cities like Portland and Brooklyn now charge $15 for a small bowl of what pioneers ate by the spoonful. The wisdom went underground. The food stayed the same. Second pattern break. Here is the part of the story that does not get told. In 1840, an estimated 30 million buffalo roamed the Great Plains. By 1890, fewer than 1,000 remained. Pioneers were not the primary cause. Commercial hunters in the 1870s and 1880s killed buffalo by the millions for their hides alone, leaving the meat to rot in the sun. But the wagon trains played their part. Every pioneer family that crossed the plains ate buffalo when they could get it, and a single bull yielded enough meat to feed a family for weeks. What modern food science has slowly come to recognize is that the buffalo provided a nutritional package no other animal could match. The meat was leaner than beef. The fat was higher in healthy fatty acids. The organs delivered vitamins in concentrations that no farm-raised cow could touch. Pioneers eating buffalo on the trail were healthier than the same people would have been eating only farm meat back in Indiana. They did not know why. They only knew that buffalo days felt different, stronger, like the trail had given them a gift. Number 9. Buffalo tongue. Of all the cuts of buffalo, the tongue was the most prized. It was the first piece pioneers butchered after a kill, often eaten the same night around the fire, while the rest of the carcass was still being processed. The tongue was either boiled in a pot of salted water for 2 hours until tender enough to slice with a butter knife, or smoked over a slow fire and saved for later. The flavor was rich, almost beef-like but with a finer texture, sometimes described as the closest thing to veal a pioneer would ever taste. Travelers wrote home about it in tones that bordered on religious. A buffalo tongue sliced thin and laid across a hot biscuit was the kind of meal that made grown men quiet for a long time afterward. Eastern markets caught on by the late 1860s, and pickled buffalo tongue became a delicacy sold in New York and Philadelphia for prices that the original pioneers would have found laughable. They ate it for free, the privilege of the trail. Number 8. Sourdough biscuits. Every wagon train had its sourdough crock, and every sourdough crock had a name. Pioneer women started their cultures in St. Joseph or Independence before the trip began, kept them alive with regular feedings of flour and water, and slept with them in the wagon during cold nights to prevent the wild yeast from dying. Each morning, a portion of starter was mixed with flour, salt, a pinch of saleratus, and just enough water to form a thick dough. The biscuits were baked in a Dutch oven covered with hot coals, and the result was tangy, golden, and so reliable that pioneer mothers could produce them with their eyes closed. Some sourdough starters that crossed the Oregon Trail in 1846 are still alive today, passed down through 6 generations of the same family. The starter is more than yeast. It is a living connection to a great-great-great-grandmother who carried it 2,000 miles in a leather pouch tied around her neck. Number 7, jerky. Pioneers preserved meat the same way Native Americans had for centuries. Strips of buffalo, venison, or antelope were cut against the grain, rubbed with salt, and either hung over a slow, smoky fire for a day or laid out on a willow rack in direct sun for 2 or 3 days. The strips dried into hard, dark, slightly leathery pieces that would keep for months in a clean cotton sack. A pound of jerky contained roughly the nutrition of 4 pounds of fresh meat, which mattered enormously when wagon space was at a premium. Pioneer hunters carried strips in their saddlebags and gnawed on them while riding ahead of the main party scouting for water. Children were given strips to chew as a kind of trail candy. The flavor was concentrated, smoky, and intense, nothing at all like the soft, sweetened modern jerky sold in gas stations. Real trail jerky was hard enough to crack a tooth on if you bit down wrong. The toughness was the point. Soft jerky was wasted jerky. Soft jerky spoiled. Number 6, hardtack. Hardtack was the meal that nobody wanted but everybody packed. Flour, water, and salt mixed into a stiff dough, rolled out flat, scored into squares, pricked with holes to prevent rising, and baked until every drop of moisture had been driven out. The result was a cracker so dense and dry that it could survive a year in a damp wagon without going bad. A single hardtack cracker contained about 100 calories of pure starch, which was exactly what an exhausted ox driver needed at the end of a 14-hour day. Pioneers softened the crackers by soaking them in coffee, in soup, or in bacon grease until they could be chewed without breaking a tooth. The most common preparation, called skilly-gally, involved frying soaked hardtack in bacon fat until the edges crisped golden. It was bland, heavy, and utterly satisfying. The Civil War made hardtack famous, but the Oregon Trail made it essential. Every overland wagon train carried at least 50 pounds per adult. Some carried twice that. Nobody loved it. Everybody owed it their life. Number 5, dried beans. The most economical food on the Oregon Trail was a 50-pound sack of dried navy beans, which cost about 4 cents a pound in Independence in 1945 and could feed a family of 6 for over a month. The beans had one major drawback. They took 4 to 6 hours to cook properly, which meant that pioneer women had to start them at breakfast for them to be ready by supper. The solution was the bean pot, a heavy iron vessel that could be buried in the ashes of the cook fire each morning and dug out at the end of the day with the beans soft and the broth thick. A piece of salt pork went in for flavor. A wild onion went in for depth. Salt went in at the end so the beans would not toughen during cooking. The smell of beans cooking in a buried pot drifted across the wagon train each evening like a promise. Beans meant the family was still doing all right. Beans meant tomorrow was going to be possible. Number 4, salt pork. If the trail had a single signature food, it was salt pork. Pioneers carried it in wooden barrels lashed to the side of the wagon, where the brine sloshed audibly with every bump in the road. A 200-pound barrel cost about $8 in Missouri in 1849 and represented the entire meat budget for a family of 4 for the full 4-month journey. The pork came from the belly and back of the pig, cured for weeks in a saturated salt solution and so heavily preserved that it had to be soaked in fresh water for hours before it could be eaten without making the cook's eyes water. Once desalted, the pork was sliced thick, fried in a cast-iron pan until the fat rendered out, and used as the foundation for nearly every other meal of the day. The grease seasoned the beans. The crispy meat went on the biscuits. The drippings made the gravy. Nothing was wasted. A barrel of salt pork was 4 months of survival sitting in a wooden box, and pioneer mothers protected it like they protected their children. Third pattern break. Here is the truth that no documentary will ever capture. Every one of these meals was made by a woman in a long dress and an apron, often pregnant, often grieving, often standing over a fire in 100-degree heat or freezing rain. She had buried a child somewhere along the trail. She had not bathed in 3 weeks. Her hands were cracked and bleeding from washing dishes in cold creek water. She was 22 years old and looked 45. And every evening, without fail, she fed her family. She mixed the cornmeal. She fried the salt pork. She stirred the beans. She poured the coffee. She did this not because it was inspiring, not because anyone thanked her, but because if she stopped, the family stopped. The cooking was the wagon. The cooking was the journey. The cooking was the difference between reaching Oregon and being buried beside the trail under a pile of stones. Every meal on this list was an act of stubborn love by a woman whose name nobody remembers. That is the part the history books leave out. Number 3, pemmican. Here is the dish modern Harvard nutritionists have studied with something close to reverence. Pemmican was the perfect survival food, invented by the Cree and Blackfoot tribes and adopted enthusiastically by pioneers, fur trappers, and Hudson's Bay Company traders. It was made by pounding lean dried meat, usually buffalo or venison, into a fine powder, then mixing it with rendered fat at a 1-to-1 ratio. Dried berries, usually choke cherries or service berries, were sometimes added for both flavor and vitamin C. The mixture was pressed into rawhide bags and sealed with melted fat, where it would keep for years without refrigeration. A pound of pemmican delivered roughly 3,500 calories, about twice the caloric density of any other portable food known to 19th century America. Pioneer hunters carried it on long scouting trips when no other food was available. Polar explorers carried it across Antarctica 50 years later. Modern nutrition researchers studying long-duration survival foods have concluded that pemmican may be one of the most complete portable foods ever devised by any human culture. The recipe is essentially unchanged from what pioneers ate in 1847. The wisdom outlasted the wagons. Number 2, buffalo hump. The single most coveted cut of meat on the Oregon Trail was the buffalo hump, a thick slab of fatty muscle that ran along the animal's shoulders. Pioneers who killed a buffalo cut out the hump first and cooked it the same night, usually wrapped in the animal's own hide and buried in a pit of hot coals for several hours. The result was meat so tender and so deeply flavored that travelers wrote home about it in tones usually reserved for religious experiences. The fat marbled through the muscle in heavy white seams that melted during cooking and basted the meat from the inside. Eastern visitors to wagon trains in the 1850s often refused to eat buffalo before they tasted it, then ate themselves nearly sick once they did. A single hump could feed a wagon train of 20 people for a full evening with leftovers for breakfast. Today, you can buy farm-raised bison hump at specialty butchers in Denver and Bozeman for prices that would have horrified a pioneer. They considered the hump payment for crossing the plains, the land's apology for the hardship of getting there. Number 1, bacon. At the top of every supply list, on the front page of every guidebook, and at the bottom of every wagon were the same 3 words: bring more bacon. Pioneers traveling the Oregon Trail in the 1840s and 1850s carried an average of 75 pounds of bacon per adult, more than any other single food besides flour. Bacon was the universal currency of the trail. It was breakfast, lunch, and dinner. It was traded with other wagon trains for medicine, rendered for cooking grease, used to bait fishing lines, to lubricate squeaky axles, and as a poultice for snake bites and cracked lips. A slab could last 3 months if kept cool and dry, and a single pound contained enough fat and protein to fuel an adult through a hard day on the trail. The smell of bacon frying over a buffalo chip fire at dawn is what pioneer children remembered for the rest of their lives. Decades later, when they were old and living in Portland or Sacramento with running water and electric lights, they could still close their eyes and smell it. That smell was the entire 2,000-mile journey. That smell was Oregon. That smell was the reason any of them made it. Here's the challenge. Pick one of these and make it this week. Cook a pot of Pioneer pottage. Fry up a slab of salt pork. Bake a tray of Johnny cakes. Then sit at the table and think about the woman in the long dress who made the same meal over a buffalo chip fire in 1846, with her children watching and the wind blowing dust into the pan. Tell me in the comments which one you tried. I want to know if the hardtack gets more love than the pemmican. I want to know if anyone is brave enough to try the rattlesnake. Because these were not just meals. They were the long, slow act of staying alive across the widest stretch of country this nation has ever known.